So this is, and I'll pull it up here. Share this. So this is something I've been sitting with this. Well, this is the quote we'll be working with, and I'll just read up until the quote. But the quote is, let me give a little hint on how to listen. The point is not to listen to a series of propositions, but rather to follow the movement of showing. So I've been thinking about that for like literally over 20 years, this one. And it's like, it's one of those ones that like, I think I understand it, and then I really understand it. And I think, okay, now I understand it. And then but then I realized I didn't understand it at all. And now I understand it. It's like, it's been one of those ones that it just keeps going deeper and deeper and deeper. And it touches on so many things. So this has been a personal koan for me. So I'll go ahead and read up to this point. So this is a transcript of of Heidegger speaking at the memorial. I believe it's the reunion memorial of a physicist. I think it's Heisenberg's death. Right, so he was invited to speak, and it's kind of evocative because the title of this, I think this was done in the mid 50s, if I remember right, and the title of this is evocative in the sense that, you know, it's called Time and Being, and so people who are into Heidegger understand that there's one of the big the kind of the mysteries of Heidegger is he wrote his seminal work, right, Being in Time, in 1927, and it had a projected second part of it. It was in the outline that he never wrote, and so there's been all kinds of debates about, like, where, why didn't he write it? Did he actually write it? Right? Was there a turn? Was there a change in his thinking such it made it impossible? And so in some sense, that's kind of a mystery around Heidegger, right? That you hear about, like, of Heideggerians and people talk about. So that he came out with this, right? This little thing called Time and Being. You can see him almost playing with that mystery, right? Like, because he still leaves it, there's ambiguity about whether or not this actually is him speaking to that or not, right? So there's something kind of mysterious just in the title of this, in the name of the talk. Okay, so I'll go ahead and read it. The following lecture calls for a few words of introduction. If we were to be shown right now two pictures by Paul Klee in the original, which he painted in the year of his death, the watercolor Spear or Saints from a Window, and Death and Fire, Tempera on Burlap, we should want to stand before them for a long while, and should abandon any claim that they be immediately intelligible. If it were possible right now to have George Trakell's poem, Serpent of Death, recited to us, perhaps even by the poet himself, we should want to hear it often and should abandon any claim that it be immediately intelligible. If Werner Heisenberg right now were to present some of his thoughts in theoretical physics, moving in the direction of the cosmic formula for which he is searching, 2 or 3 people in the audience, at most, would be able to follow him, while the rest of us would, without protest, abandon any claim that he be immediately intelligible. Not so with the thinking that is called philosophy. That thinking is supposed to offer worldly wisdom, quote unquote, and perhaps even be a, quote, way to the blessed life, unquote. But it might be that this kind of thinking is today placed in a position which demands of it reflection, that are far removed from any useful practical wisdom. It might be that a kind of thinking has become necessary which must give thought to matters from which even the painting and the poetry, which we have mentioned, and the theory of mathematical physics receive their determination. Here, too, we should then have to abandon any claim to immediate intelligibility. However, this is an important part. However, we should still have to listen because we must think what is inevitable but preliminary. Therefore, we must be neither surprised nor amazed if the majority of the audience objects to the lecture. Whether a few will, now or later, be prompted by the lecture to think further on such matters cannot be foreseen. In other words, this moment couldn't have been predicted by Heidegger that we're sitting here doing this. We want to say something about the attempt to think being without regard to its being grounded in terms of beings. We want to say something about the attempt to think being without regard to its being grounded in terms of beings. The attempt to think being without beings becomes necessary because otherwise, it seems to me, there is no longer any possibility of explicitly bringing into view the being of what is today all over the earth, let alone of adequately determining the relation of man to what has been called being up to now. And here's the part that we will practice reflecting on. Let me give a hint, a little hint on how to listen. The point is not to listen to a series of propositions, but rather to follow the movement of showing. let me give a little hint on how to listen. The point is not to listen to a series of propositions, but rather to follow the movement of showing. All right. So just any questions about just so far about clarity on just in terms of clarity about what I read? No. So I think this just some context here is I think one of the things probably with Heidegger is, in some sense, Heidegger is trying to, as a philosopher, is constantly, you could say, asking himself, sometimes over and over and over again, who is it that philosophizes, right? Like, what is it to really think, right? And where does philosophy, or where does philosophy stop being philosophy, right? And become something else while still calling itself philosophy, right? And I think that he's kind of pointing to here that there's something about the philosopher that is, that in some sense we call it thinking, but it's hard for Heidegger. I think what he seems to evoke is hearkening back to the original beginning of philosophical thinking, which is it's more about listening, right? It's a listening to something, right? That is maybe speaks through beings, but isn't those beings, right? It's the being of being. And in listening, thinking is something like what one finds oneself as they're listening and sounding out what they're hearing, right? And so he kind of sets this up really well. And like he notes points where there's ways in which we're actually okay with, right? Not totally grasping something, that something not be immediately intelligible, right? And there's certain senses where it's just like, it's so obvious that there's more going on there that I can comprehend, yet there's a respect, right? A respectful repose from my demand to understand it right away, right? But the very basis and the terms of all the things that he's talking about, what all those things are built on, right, are in some sense are ontological terms that those very things that we easily grant to not be immediately intelligible, right, are what originally philosophy first thinks, right? This notion of the ontological concept that becomes operational, right? And so he's saying that we, in this one part down here where he talks about not so with philosophy, right? We kind of demand that it explain things and that it give us something that's really intelligible and it give us a good life. And but then he's saying that I think he's saying in there that we stop listening at that point, right? That we stop actually listening to what is most mysterious, right? And begin to very slowly and very, very humbly sound out what we hear that is maybe not yet been said, right? Yet is more true and more primordially the case than any that determine all the other things that we just mentioned that we don't demand immediate intelligible for. So in some sense, he's restoring genuine thinking, right? Genuine philosophical thinking. And then there was that point in there when he talks about, he starts to set up listening, where it's like, and the lecture. I thought it was a great pre-frame, right, for the lecture. You may find that as listening to this lecture that you may not understand it, right? This cannot be said, but still too, we should have to listen, right? So there's this kind of, see, there's this aspect here where you can kind of feel this kind of, this quality of that even though I don't immediately, I can't immediately, it's not immediately graspable or useful or something, right? Or clearly applicable for my life, or I can't, if I can't immediately make money out of it or optimize it or whatever, and I don't understand it, that he's calling for something, right? That even there, we should still have to listen. And so right there is an invocation, right? It's like that one, it's creating a sense of a domain that it is possible that even when we don't understand something, and even when it doesn't evoke any practical utility, right, that we can still listen to it, right? That it's possible to listen to something that we don't already understand, right? And then at the very end, he kind of brings this all together, in my estimation, and we can sit with this. And so then he tells us a little instruction, right, of what's possible. Let me give a little hint on how to listen, right? So first of all, right there, he's kind of saying something interesting, because he's saying, because I think that usually people don't, I've never met anybody that thinks to themselves that they don't listen, right? Right? Let alone that they've thought that there's a way that they listen. Usually listening is just that. I think the common sense notion of listening is just like making sure I stay quiet until you're done talking, right? That, and then somehow listening just happens. So right here, he's kind of making a distinction about listening, in that, let me give a little hint on how to listen, so that there, I think this evokes that there's a way to listen, right? There's a way to listen. And then he says, then in this next point, right, I think he starts to point to the kind of listening that he's evoking is distinct from the way that we normally listen, right? And I think it comes into this. The point is not to listen to a series of propositions, right? The point is not to listen to a series of propositions, but rather to follow the movement of showing. So I just think it's interesting right there that there's something about, right, that he's talking about listening, and then he goes along and he says, like, listen, like, not like, refrain from listening to a series of propositions. But in doing that, what opens up is something like this, the movement of showing for which we can follow, right? Follow the movement of showing, right? So that's, I think, probably enough just to kind of give some context, right, to sink our teeth into. Any clarifying questions about that? Anything anyone want to add? Feel ready to kind of sit with this? All right. So I tell you what, I'm going to go ahead and copy this into the chat, so we can look at it and read it if we want. So I'll go ahead and I'll set the timer for 5 minutes, and then we can close our eyes, or in whatever way that has you just kind of come to quiet, find your quiet. And we'll meditate for 5 minutes, and then we'll go into the precious speaking part. All right, ready? Get set. meditate. would say that the prop, yeah, we can just read the whole quote, and I'll go ahead and go first. So we'll go in the circle that I have here anyways. So it'll be, I'll go first, then Thomas, then Molly, then Leonard, and then Daniel. Then Guy, Thomas, Molly, Leonard, Daniel. Okay. And this part is called what is this one? It's ruminate chanting. So in some sense, it's evoking the chanting of the phrase, right? Let me give a hint on how to listen. The point is not to listen to a series of propositions, but rather to follow the movement of showing. Thomas.
Let me give a little hint on how to listen. The point is not to listen to a series of propositions, but rather to follow the movement of showing.
Unmute, Molly.
Let me give a little hint on how to listen. The point is not to listen to a series of propositions, but rather to follow the movement of showing.
Let me give a little hint on how to listen. The point is not to listen to a series of propositions, but rather to follow the movement of showing.
Let me give a little hint on how to listen. The point is not to listen to a series of propositions, but rather to follow the movement of showing.
Let me give a little hint on how to listen. The point is not to listen to a series of propositions, but rather to follow the movement of showing.
Let me give a little hint on how to listen. The point is not to listen to a series of propositions, but rather to follow the movement of showing.
Let me give a little hint on how to listen. The point is not to listen to a series of propositions, but rather to follow the movement of showing.
Let me give a little hint on how to listen. The point is not to listen to a series of propositions, but rather to follow the movement of showing.
Let me give a little hint on how to listen. The point is not to listen to a series of propositions, but rather to follow the movement of showing.
Let me give a little hint on how to listen. The point is not to listen to a series of propositions, but rather to follow the movement of showing.
Let me give a little hint on how to listen. The point is not to follow a series of propositions, but rather to follow the movement of showing.
Let me give a little hint on how to listen. The point is not to listen to a series of propositions, but rather to follow the movement of showing.
Let me give a little hint on how to listen. The point is not to listen to a series of propositions, but rather to follow the movement of showing.
Let me give a little hint on how to listen. The point is not to listen to a series of propositions, but rather to follow the movement of showing.
Let me give a little hint on how to listen. The point is not to listen to a series of propositions, but rather to follow the movement of showing.
Let me give a little hint on how to listen. The point is not to listen to a series of propositions, but rather to follow the movement of showing.
Let me give a little hint on how to listen. The point is not to listen to a series of propositions, but to follow the movement of showing.
Let me give a little hint on how to listen. The point is not to listen to a series of propositions, but rather to follow the movement of showing.
Let me give a little hint on how to listen. The point is not to listen to a series of propositions, but rather to follow the movement of showing.
Let me give a little hint on how to listen. The point is not to listen to a series of propositions, but rather to follow the movement of showing.
Let me give a little hint on how to listen. The point is not to listen to a series of propositions, but rather to follow the movement of showing.
Let me give a little hint on how to listen. The point is not to listen to a series of propositions, but to follow the movement of showing.
Let me give a little hint on how to listen. The point is not to listen to a series of propositions, but rather to follow the movement of showing.
Let me give a little hint on how to listen. The point is not to listen to a series of propositions, but rather to follow the movement of showing.
And now I'm going to suggest that we go into the next part, right, which is precious speaking. And this is the part where the Lectio Divina part, the sacred reading part, which is, just to review a little bit, is it really is when you do Lectio Divina, right? It's to, in some sense, you pay attention to what the text lights up in you, right? So it's like what it evokes and invokes in you, how it, what comes alive in you. So what we'll do is we'll go in order, right, in the same order, and we'll all go and just take our time to practice precious speaking, and at the same time talking about what lights up, but also savoring it in the saying it, right? Savoring it. So what's there for me is, what's alive in me is this, I have this sense in which there's something about this where it seems what's lighting up is the sense in which I'm always listening. That listening is not something for which I occasionally do or not do, but there's something about what he's hinting at, literally hinting at, is that which is that I'm always, there's never a moment where perhaps I'm not listening. And this hinting, in some sense, wakes me up to what is already the case. Thomas.
In the last two read-throughs, there was, with my eye closed, there was like a, suppose like a Tinkerbell, like a little, like a fairy whose light, but whose sparkling was music. And that got closer and closer and closer and closer. And then in that last round, it was like that light, which was that little thing of music, like following a little thing in a dark forest, and went back to like a pool that was like a light. It was like it was glowing, but it was also, there was a sounding. So it was like the showing that was being spoken and being listened to was bringing to the place that was both light and sound, but as one, but encountered as a liminal or something.
Molly.
For me, I feel sort of a desire and almost sadness. I feel like a little bit like it makes me what it lights up for me, what it makes me feel is listening to propositions is like we're kind of at sea, and then I want to hold on to this raft. Like I really want to hold on to this raft of following the showing, but I can't do that through my normal mechanisms of listening, because I the way I usually do it is I try to concentrate, and then when I realize I'm not concentrating, then I bring myself back in. But it's an attention to like an atomistic division of time, rather than an undulating kind of deeper sense or so. So I feel a kind of desire and almost kind of Faustian sort of sadness. That's what's coming up for me.
Leonard.
Well, so for not having an English year, I guess, I'm kind of was all the time translating it. But since I was also listening to the lecture, the recorded lecture in German, I guess what like strikes out or like sparks out for me is like this, not to listen to a series of propositions, because in German it's like you have the Aussagesatz proposition, and it's this part, the Satz. It can be the jump, but also you can have it in Einsatz, like in inception. So I'm kind of paid attention to this part where it's like a receiving of this inceptive trait to it, that it gets kind of invoked in this circling, let's say, circling movement.
At one point, I was just kind of like listening, but also smelling, sensing the kind of like the kind of lushness of the ever coming into the present, the kind of like freshness of every new moment that's showing itself in what we're doing here. Although we kind of like just repetitively invoked this sentence, there was always something new lightening up in all of your voices and in the silence that followed along. Just try to enjoy that, just being present to that.
Listening to all of you and then sinking into just my experience of this reading. I'm present to this I'm actually present to this quality my grandfather had. Especially when it says, let me give you a hint on how to listen. This hint struck me surprisingly. It's like, because he was always fucking with me. He was always teasing, but there was always something he was evoking in his teasing, right? And he was German. And this hinting to that there's more going on, right? Always than I'm currently seeing. And just this hint that doesn't give it away. It's friendly, yet it's profound, yet it's challenging. Doesn't give it away, but it just lets somehow the sense of hinting, letting me know that there's something like a movement of showing underneath all of it, right? That is obvious to perhaps the hinter, but but only this kind of evoking, yes, that's it. Awareness of concealment, right? And a hint on where to look, right? To the darkness that may show. Mm-hmm. Thomas. We'll do a few rounds of this going around and then we'll open up to the next one.
I've still been kind of dwelling in that kind of imaginality. And then in the listening through what was just said, it was like that playful and even tricky being guided toward this pool that was both light and music. It was like I wanted to like get on my knees and like anoint myself or like baptize myself. There was something just wanting to touch what is wanting to touch what brought me to it. I don't know. It feels very sacred.
Molly.
Yeah, I'm thinking about trying. So, like, two things are popping up for me. One thing is the idea that every moment there's a choice, and we can either choose to stay or we can choose to be taken outside, and it's never a stuck situation. You can always choose. And what I mean by being taken outside is to experience a feeling of openness and wonder and difference. And for some reason, for me, it's like I think of it like a kind of like a convex kind of shape, like coming from my stomach or something. Like your arms are open for a hug or something, but it's like coming from your stomach. Whereas maybe like, yeah, thinking about that choice and how that can give a sense of optimism, having that choice. One thing. And then the other thing, how I have to constantly change my almost lens, because I find if I get stuck in a particular way of understanding a word from a different, even if it's from diverse speakers, especially within philosophy, it can keep me within the concave rather than, have I got those mixed up? I mean the one that's like a dome shape versus the one that's like an upside down dome. And I'm trying to foster the one that's like an upside down dome, but like an openness. But yeah, so I find with the words, it's almost like I'm beginning to understand it now, that it's like you have to listen to the throughness, like even the physicality of the word. And Daniel said something about the silence after the words, the kind of energetic shift and the kind of that which sort of hangs in the air after the words, as well as the words and who's speaking them, but not in a judgmental way, just in the tonality and the feel of it. So yeah, so that's what the two things, like the one thing is this idea of having a choice, and then the second thing is having to be active within that choice of paying attention, but not in a way where words are code, where words are rules or legally ascribed and set. There needs to be some way of making them. And it makes me think of Heidegger, where he says, like, an ever renewed, thoughtful deliberateness, this that idea of the new. How can we sustain the new? So yeah, that's what it's opening up for me. Sorry if I went on for too long.
Your poetry. Thank you. Leonard.
So, I mean, for me, like holding some kind of space for where something like attention can happen. What kind of happened for me as you were speaking and talking about your grandfather was this kind of, your voice reaching out to me and kind of moving like around, my head. And it's like this moment when it's like passing through the, the back part, the part that is not like in sight, like in the like let's say the plane of sight. This is like a eerie or awry moment, at least as I noticed it, and it, because it was kind of your intonations and the voice, your voice was resonating for me, even not, I don't know, so much for the particular words, but like a particular like, let's say, phase of the sentences you spoke. This was happening, and it's like, there's this there can be this aspect to it when a voice breaks silence, but this was more like, it's like a voice, diving into, or like speaking into silence, or like this dark blind spot. Yeah.
So what kind of like is opening up for me is kind of like that when I listen to Molly, that the words kind of like have a plasticity, kind of like they're full of life, they're brimming over with life, they're vibrant and energetic, and they also have a kind of direction. They can lead us towards places. And again, I'm just trying to enjoy that and savor it and see how even the darkness of the silence is pregnant with this life.
I'm noticing I'm chanting hymns. This sense of hiddenness, playful hiddenness, is what I'm present to. This sense of that I could, in my efforting to understand, not notice, I'm enacting, missing the whole thing. And that there's something about that I can listen, and there's a way I listen, and that restraint from some habitual way of listening opens something up that I couldn't listen for, in some sense. Like there's this kind of quality when he says, let me give you a hint, like rather than listen to something that like a proposition is something I could either agree with or not, right? Which means I'm already have something upon which that proposition either agrees with or not, right? And what he's, so what I'm hearing him saying is like the hint, right, is don't try to listen for a movement to showing. It's more like refrain from that. And in refraining from that, right, we may find something like following the movement of showing. Something may show itself that that it's possible to listen to that. There's a way I'm listening. And in this case, probably I can maybe begin to hear that I haven't listened. And in hearing that I haven't listened is the moment something else opens up, right? This sense of, in this sense of it, I like that image that you talked about, the concave or the convex, right? The dome, like that kind of conceals, or the dome that opens, right? In that way, just that kind of quality of just a shift of my capacity in recognizing my own folliness, in some sense, my own self-concealment, right? And my own tightening and significance of my propositions, right? That if I just take the hint, right, and refrain from what I wasn't noticing that I was even doing, and a world opens up. A world can open up and show itself that we can find ourselves following. Thomas, we'll do one more round of this.
I've been kind of dwelling still in where I was, but it keeps, through listening, kind of more keeps happening. But now I'm kind of wondering how, let's say, in this, just the way I'm imagining it, this, to be in this darkness, and then to have that glimmering musical thing to even approach you in the first place through that darkness, is that there's like this, like a like knows like or something, but then that darkness then is kind of like this empty instrumental attunement that needs to be there in order to even find that thing again, that nonetheless, there's something about like actually considering attunement as this this emptiness for that singing, listening, guiding. Just something about that. That's just where I am right now.
Molly.
Yeah, I think that's just in relation to what both of you said, it making me think about this idea of listening to listening, but also a kind of cautiousness and maybe even surrender, where because sometimes it's like I'm listening and I'm like, ooh, I just had a great idea. Let's cling to that and get ready for my turn. and then I'm like, actually, maybe that was lovely, but maybe if I loosen that, if I surrender a little bit into this moment, then I'm willing to receive more and I'll learn more. So that's what came up for me. But the shiny thing that did come up as well that I wanted to cling to was like, I was fascinated before, and I hadn't remembered that I've been fascinated with this for ages, but I was fascinated with, I wanted to make a sound with the most glorious ring. I wanted to sing with the most glorious ring. And that ring, it's like, it's part of the sound, but it's mostly the atmosphere the sound leaves afterwards. And I just find it fascinating when we're talking about attunement or kind of like strings buzzing, you know, it's a similar thing with the voice. There's like a buzz that remains afterwards, and it's just like this kind of hallelujah ring that is like shines in your ears. And but the interesting thing is that's almost with that, like what I was talking about before is like a cautiousness and a surrender and a kind of timidity. But with that, it's like it's a little bit like all guns blazing, you know. It's like, yeah, you know. So how, but I feel there's a connection between the two. Like maybe we can't go straight for that. Not that one is better than the other or anything, but something about that ring, I'm not quite sure how you get it, but it's a magical thing as well as the kind of cautious surrender. So yeah.
So I guess for me, it was or is particularly noticeable or remarkable that there is kind of, you know, from this place or where kind of where we speak now as like a group, it's kind of you know, it's there's something like raising up from there, and it's like taking hold of like, let's say, of this of the space of attention that I'm kind of holding, you know, this kind of locus that I was detaching before. It's kind of, you know, suddenly, but it was like a noticeable like ongoing wavy kind of swelling up. It's kind of now it's kind of filled, you know, it's kind of swept up from off, you know, this nowhere. So yeah, this is kind of what I can say now.
Daniel.
I'm just been trying to savor how, what I noticed now, how our words and our language is kind of like hearkening into the silence that kind of like sustains us all, and how that kind of like emanates a kind of rhythm, a kind of musicality that is very, very pure and very light, and that I just want to kind of like let go of so it can flourish and be full of life and just go on.
So now we will move into what is called intentional conversing or conversing. And this is just where we kind of, in some sense, speak and also in response to the other person, kind of like jazz, pick up, kind of maybe recreate what the other says, riff on it. And at the same time, we want to evoke, we want to maintain the kind of the meditative quality of both that this is happening, including what's being said, right? And kind of like feel the interpenetration of those and the attunement of that. And at the same time, we may want to notice what's showing, that that goes into the background as the anonymous invisible hand. You may want to listen for that, if there are such a thing. I'm noticing a playfulness come up in me. And I've been thinking about this sense of sound. You know, it's interesting in this what he's talking about, because he's telling us, he's talking about listening. And then if there's a way that we listen, then he uses something, he says something that connotates somewhat vision, right? Showing. Yet he doesn't say follow showing. He says follow the movement of showing. So there's something to hear in that, right? So there's even something evoking in that, right? Like it's, in some sense, something that shows itself seems, right? That somehow gives itself. But then what he's saying is follow through listening, begin to follow. So maybe listening and following, right? So here's this kind of maybe what is like listening and following, right? The movement of showing, right? So there's something worth hearing, right? In this movement of showing, that there's something intelligible in that seems to be worthy of letting go of our precious propositions. Yeah, just go ahead. Yeah, you can just jump in. Free form.
No, I was just going to say.
Nice hand. I just want to let you know it's a good hand.
I just wasn't sure if we were, yeah. But no, I was just going to say, yeah, even hint makes me think of like glint. Like I was thinking of like glint, light, hint, little plays of light and dark and sneaking around corners. And I just think glint is like a lovely word. So I was, just as you were about to say it, I was thinking about this interaction between hearing and seeing and glinting and hinting, and playfulness as well. And I was also thinking about comparing what you were saying to my run this morning, because I feel there's a lot of twisty turny roads, and I actually love them even more than the big expansive views. Are these little pathways and trees at different angles and different distances, and you're moving through them, but it is this moment of surrender, but surrender and listening into something playful and light and full, you know? So it's like, I'm like, okay, I'm going to stop with my inner monologue now and just look at this and not look at it like a landscape, like a two-dimensional thing, just to try and get into the rhythm of it as I'm moving. And there's just little, it's like, yes, I feel the music metaphor is really cool, because it's like that you have a rhythm and the landscape has a rhythm, and there's a momentary hum between you, or sort of resonance, which brings life. And the other thing, it's like the Aboriginal concept of song tracks, or song lines, or they're called song lines, or something tracks. I can't remember. There's another term. It's a translation, obviously, but it's about how it's Australian Aboriginals, and the land. There are these invisible trails in the land which need to be. They're kept alive through song. It's not just that they're become they're created through song, like a creation myth, which is in many cultures, but they're also sustained through song. And they're kind of invisible tracks. And yeah, I just find that metaphor extremely, for whatever it is, that whether it's in landscape or whether it's in dialogos, that mysterious thing that's hidden, that you want to connect with. I think music and song and attunement is really a metaphor, but also it's not, as you say, Guy, it's not something really serious. Like, it's like playful, it's light and it's joyous. So and yeah, so anyway, I went over, there we go. Yeah, that's all I wanted to say.
One thing I was reminded of when you were just speaking, and then after that, a thing to relate to what you mentioned prior, was that in that following those trails, the image of Simba following Rafiki in The Lion King, and of course Rafiki is this very tricksy, musical, poetical shaman type figure, and there's Simba, who's this dumb little runt who's just trying to catch him. But Rafiki can navigate, let's say, he's like a master of the trails and the landscapes and getting lost and then re-emerging back out. He's this very enigmatic figure. And then it's just like Simba's ignorance keeps getting hit with a stick, hit with a tree, hit with another thing. But Rafiki's rhythm is already, there's something, he already knows it. And then Simba's is following of it. But then there was this thing about even perhaps what I think it was you, Molly, said something about this caution. And I don't know if you meant it in this way, but it hit me in this kind of way, where it was like, this might be the thing where someone like a Rafiki might have this kind of experience. I'm not trying to equate myself with that, but there was, when you mentioned caution, maybe in one of the going arounds, with that image that kept just I don't know, unfolding in my mind. It was like I was an old man sitting around that swelling, that thing which was light and sound, and it was like, it's like the most worthy thing to follow, in terms of like, it's the most worthy thing to be near, and there's something like eternal about it. But in my imagining myself as an old man next to it, there was this instance of, well, that may be eternal, but I still may die. Well, no, I will die. But there was something about, it's one of the most worthwhile things to be near, listen for, and to follow. But it's just, there's something just like my mortality is meeting that eternity. And it can't, just, there's something there. So there was this caution, because I was imagining myself as an old man sitting next to this thing with a smile on my face, but that I didn't know that I wasn't attending to my aging in the meantime. And I'll leave that there, but there's also this mortality and eternity.
Mm. Mm. The thing I'm present to. When you said that thing that's most worthy, right, to be drawn towards, right, in some sense to bring my mortality to its eternity, and that kind of obviousness of profundity to be near towards, right? Like, or to move towards that sense. And this sense of, you know, in the beginning when he talked about like maybe it'd be a good idea, right, that we stand before certain things and not demand that they be immediately intelligible. And in some sense, it's interesting because I hear in that something that's so personally been so crucial for me, right? And even kind of my survival on some levels at stake, kind of having learning disabilities when I was a kid and dyslexia and stuff. And having reading took a long time for me to learn, and a miracle teacher. But one of the things that I think that afforded me was the ability to tolerate not understanding what I was reading, yet still encountering something, right? And I think that in some sense, this it actually strikes me as an ability now to be before something and have it not be immediately intelligible, yet there's a way of listen, but to still have to listen, as I said, right? To still have to listen seems to be some, evokes some kind of showing, right? That if it was intelligible, I may not see, it may not speak to me, right? I was thinking about this, about, you know, there's this kind of idea about like, you know, people with super high IQs, like it's this like really fast pattern recognition, right? And then there's also the image of these really slow, right, peasant folk, right? Like that probably don't have that their speed of processing isn't nearly as fast. However, there's a wisdom, right, that in some sense it strikes me that there, in this starts to speak to this sense of like how to listen, right? And how to listen precisely has to do with as much as what isn't immediately understood, but the capacity to take that hint in some sense and tolerate something for which is intelligibility is not immediate, right? That immediateness strikes me as it something, there's like a wisdom of something like a slower processor, right? You can almost see as like kind of an archetype of that, right? Where you can almost get that there's certain things that can only be shown, right, over long periods of time and over in a very slow way, that even if you're super smart, right, it's concealed, right? It's like there's some things that belong to time itself or something, right? That so this sense of being able to listen precisely to things that aren't intelligible seems to maybe allow for something to show, right, that we can find ourselves following, right? And since we've all attempted to read Heidegger, no matter how smart we are, we know exactly what I just said.
I mean, I think it's just, I know we've spoken about this before, but really, I think that moment where you have like, I just think it's just so connected with empathy and love. Like it just, the desire to want to know the unknowable, and as it is, without trying to own it by knowing it in a certain sense. There's such a care to that. and it needs to be harnessed and, you know, renewed. But it's like, and also it's just so comparable, you know, because anything that you love, you would do that for. But the quest is to try to love everything to a certain degree, so you do it for everything, you know.
Mm.
I think Thomas said in the first round of when we were just talking and saying what kind of like was lighting up for us. I think he said that there was something sacred disclosing, and he just wanted to kind of like bow down before it in reverence. And that was kind of like that, because I'm also now, for some reason, when Molly evoked, right, she was running, I kind of like, I also went into an imaginal forest. And now I'm seeing Thomas as an old man, kind of like bowing before this sacredness that is beyond all intelligibility. But I'm also trying, right, when you go into a forest and you hear the trails and tracks, and you hear, for example, there's a clearing, and you hear the wind going through it, or you hear cicadas, or you hear the birds singing, or you just hear the leaves. And there are so many sounds in the forest. And then I think even the silence is always singing in a sense, or like giving a song, and just following that is miraculous, I think. Always pointing to something that is beyond.
Just one thing, Daniel, because you made me cry. And then that there's something then that is now forming. Well, it reminds me what Ivo de Gennaro, when he spoke about what the polis was for the Greeks. And the polis was the place for the home of that thing, like let's say the good or logos or something. So it was the shelter for that, the place for free philosophizing, where man could, well, so the human being could be what the human being is, or something. But then there was, that's one of those instances where it's like, if there is the old man who dwells next to that thing, it's like they are even analogous to, let's say, like a guardian of the polis. There's something, Ivo is now just like when he talks about skale for the Greeks, holding oneself in a relation to that which holds oneself in the first place, for the place of free philosophizing. And it's that the continual, not even enacting of freedom, but to be a free human being as the guardian of that place. I don't know how to continue from that.
Thomas, I have a question. What do the tears understand?
Oh. In one sense, it's like what Daniel said, it's like that's the only thing I want to do. There's something about, like, through all the horror and pain and trauma in my life, it's like there's something about holding oneself in a relation to that which shows, and it's just the following of that. And there's beautiful moments of just fullness and lightness and alignment, and But it's only after those moments of horror when you can really be receptive to grace. Something like. But yeah, it's the only thing I want to do. But and there's also in the caution, and that's in that being the only thing I want to do, it's dangerous because I forsake other things, you know.
I have a question in relation to precisely that point, because I noticed that you say that place, and this is not to disagree, but I have a very different conception of it as places. And like that's why I was talking about landscape, because I was talking about this Aboriginal concept. We also have a concept in Irish called the Din Shankas, which is to do with the place names and what they evoke and the fables and the history and the wonder that they open up. But what's interesting about fable, myth, names of places and landscape is it's diverse. And it's the same with life. When you have, I view this as a form of intimacy, because we compared it to love. Like when you have intimacy with a landscape, when you run in it, it's very different to the intimacy you have with somebody that you love, which is again different to the intimacy you have in dialogos, which is different to the intimacy you have when reading Heidegger. Obviously there's a commonality there because there's that same sense of care and openness. But I just wonder, and the reason I just wonder whether that could not eliminate, but not eliminate a sense of loss at, say, variety in life for pursuit of the divine or something, but rather enliven the variety, rather enliven the variety and diversity of life, because we can foster that sweet humming, that sweet attunement, alignment, and kind of landed. I've always think of it as like a drop. And I wanted to bring up John Moriarty because he gives this fable of this woman who is basically she's this half seal, but she married a human being, and he hides her seal skin above. Sorry, I'm not doing it, but just to give you the quick image, which is what I want to get it. He puts her seal skin above the roof of the house, and she's cooking one day, and the drop of seal oil lands, and it's like a little droplet of attunement that sort of lands in the gut or the heart of sort of awareness, of who we are, and how we are. And I just wonder whether that droplet could be found across life, across landscapes, across everything.
When I've been saying place, I think I mean it in precisely in the way that you're asking it, is that eternity can open up anywhere, because it's not bound by the finitude in which we encounter it. So that's even why I think I well up so much, because it's like.
Can I ask?
Yeah.
Why then would it be missing out on anything then?
Oh, what do you mean? Can you say a little more?
Because just because you seem to say, and forgive me if if this is too personal or something, but
no problem.
You seem to say that you are keen, and keen isn't the right word, but this is motivating you, like it's motivating your life to pursue this, but you're also worried about missing out by pursuing it. And what I was trying to say was, well, how could you miss out when it's everything, everywhere, and the opportunity is diverse? So that's just repeating the question, really.
Good question.
I think because, yeah, I think because it's like my cautiousness in relationship to those kinds of experiences is like even though it is everywhere, but it's not that it's everywhere. It's like you can open, but other things call for you and need you to attend to them.
Just
Just
really
eating
quickly,
and
yeah, just really quickly, I was just wondering, is part of what the tears on the hand have to do with some sense of loss? There's a movedness, right? But then there's a recognition, it sounds like, of maybe some kind of loss. I just want to listen to it. And in some sense, I want to listen to it. I'm noticing I want to listen to it, not like it's your subjective experience, but like what's present. Like it's part of what's showing.
No, I have the feeling to, or like what I'm thinking about is that, this feeling that there is something lost. And in relation to what you just said, that like to paying attention or to listen to what is like showing or revealing, like in this really, in a sense, yeah, like really, there is this, in this sake where there's like this really personal, like really personal side to it. Like when, kind of death is taking up your abiding and bring you to face, or like bring you, let's say it like this, bring you like an image how you are, like an old person, this condensed way of where like, time and being are kind of, they are implied. It's like you can relate to, you know how it will feel in a sense, but then again it's kind of far away. But what I want to say is that this, I have this, I think that this kind of sense of lostness, or it kind of, for me, it could kind of have to do with this striving to to get at this beyond, in terms of being, be just, I don't know, a quantum or like a punctum of light or whatever, but, and then if you want to, catch it or encapsulate it or whatever, that this is not possible, in a sense, but then again, to, and it kind of, I think, like for me at least, it kind of tunes in with what Molly said, or like how she elaborated on this, is this, to then, pay attention to how it kind of shifts, or what is then shifting in this. It's not anymore about a quantum, or I don't know, like the beyond of a sun, like Plato's sun or whatever, but kind of, it's this shifting that is like a showing and revealing in itself, and it's not, it's not a place beyond, but it's kind of shifting in your, in your, into your openness, in a sense. And for me, this is like the moment also, where this, kind of this sense of having lost something can shift, because it's like, I cannot miss out, I don't know, the quantum punctum, or like the point, or that I want to go beyond to, but like even not in a metaphysical sense. But then it's like really the shifting that that kind of shows itself, you know.
I might just say quickly, it reminds me, like, if we can take Guy's experience as like a fable, which he said at the beginning, which was that he thought, you know, something happened with circling, then began to think he understood it. But each time he's like, I never understood it. Now I understand it. It's like, I thought of that, and I also thought of kind of like, so it's like each time is like new and different, and yeah, and growing. I also thought, though, there's a weirdness to it too, because I thought of like Hansel and Gretel. I'm not sure why, but like leaving the food to trace your way home, and then you walk home and all the birds have eaten it all. I'm not quite sure where that leaves us, but something about following a path and the birds simultaneously, or even leaving a path behind you and the birds also being involved. But maybe they're, you know, benevolent, playful birds that, you know, love to give us hints and glints and, you know, not to give us the full story. Or maybe they're not, I don't know. But I'm not quite sure how to be honest, that's what I love about fable and image in general, is like, I'm not quite sure how to even moralize around that image. But for some reason, it's just like screaming at me, this like Hansel and Gretel tale. Yeah.
What I would like to say, because while I'm listening to you, kind of like the following came to my mind. At first, I wanted to go to Thomas in my imaginal forest and give him like an imaginal hug or a hand. And in that kind of reaching, or in that kind of holding, we not just hold ourselves, but we also kind of like get in touch with this moreness, with this sacred moreness we cannot really describe. And so we are not just touching ourselves, but we are also touching this inexhaustible other thing that kind of like opens up in these precious moments. And I'm kind of like, you know, also because it's Easter, right? I was then thinking of Nishitani's interpretation of the cross and how this sign of the cross can kind of like open up a field where such an agapic account is even possible. So we are not just in touch with ourselves, but we also hold ourselves in this dimension of inexhaustible divine agapic love. And kind of like just feeling the light of that and how it holds us and sustains us, and how we are kind of like in danger of losing it. And it's also for me, it's also kind of like I hear it in Scholé, right? There are these traces of it, and yeah, it makes us so vulnerable in a sense, because we are so tiny and fragile and red mortal in the face of that kind of like super eternality. Yeah, so I'm kind of like now getting, it's almost like there's a giant tension in me, right? I'll just kind of like find the right words and say it in the right way.
What does attention understand?
What
is the tension understand?
Once more.
What does the tension understand?
does the tension understand? That we are kind of like, right? I cannot control it. It just kind of like impresses itself onto my being. And it's just, it's disclosing to me how vulnerable and I am. And I've, right, just when Thomas kind of like started crying, I also kind of like, I was reminded of my own vulnerability and how I kind of like overcome this in these situations with kind of like a great investiture of trust into you. Because if I wouldn't have that trust, I kind of like would fall into my shell, which happened a lot in the past. And that's even worse. And that's just horror and terror in a sense. Because right, when you make yourself, when you show your vulnerability, it's easy to also just harvest hurt and pain and all of that. But I have to overcome myself to kind of like trust you and that you kind of like you speak in something like with the logos and with love and all of that. So that's why I got kind of like my vulnerability is now very strong. I'm like I'm brimming with with my being kind of like, because I'm kind of like at the edge of where I would crumble in a sense.
I welcome your voice.
Where I would just want to run away and hide somewhere.
Yeah, I want to just say quickly as well, Thomas, like I wasn't trying to disagree with you. I actually also felt like giving you a hug, but my response was this kind of like urgent justification of your request. So sorry if it seemed, it was like, I was just like, oh no, Thomas is sad, you know, or it might be, you know, I don't know, we're like vulnerable. I'm not quite sure. It's not the quite correct phrase, but yeah.
that we're circling around this sense of vulnerability, right? It's something I just want to, I just noticed I have just a big welcome to that and respect for it. And because I think that there's, you know, that there is something about making something, demanding that something be immediately intelligible is another way of saying, is you could almost see it as a kind of defense, right? Like the ways that we don't listen, or I only listen in terms of agreeing with you or not agreeing with you, or in some senses are already anticipating something for which I already have a conclusion. And there's a certain kind, you can hear a certain kind of loss of vulnerability in that sense, right? But there's something about listening that well, one is you find yourself listening. That's what's interesting about it. Right? You find yourself hearing, and it's this quality of like, it's a, you know, the sound is vibrational. It like it you hear with your ears, but if you ever sit and just like listen to sound, you can notice that actually one of the ways that the sound happens is hearing it in your ears, but you can hear it throughout your whole body, right? So there's this kind of way that we're just open, radically open as human beings. However, in philosophy, I think in the way that we're talking about philosophia, like Sophia, right? Philia Sophia, that's what I was looking for. The kind of that that sense, right, in which it's to think is to already admit a, a love in which I hope I can be deeply hurt by. Right? I want to be like, wound me, like just burn me up, right? Like shatter me. So Leonard, death up.
I was just reminded, there's in this lecture by Heidegger, he speaks then about Estigai Einai by Parmenides. And he's like speaking about the intonation, and of and of the ST so and how that can be unfolded, or how can we make sense, of this intonation. And it's as if, and like, in this mode of and the hints that he's giving, it's like if, you are hearing through, you are, and it, you're hearing through, and okay, and like you are not only, it's not only hearing, in the sense of like, you are like assuming that he's giving you some, as he said, right, that he's giving you some propositions, but it's rather that you are like, you are called up to follow, and in a sense that is also, I think, at least for me, that's also how I conceive like our gathering, our fellowship here. It's like, this, and as you said, like, there is this radical, I think you greatly described it, Guy. There's this radical openness, and in the sense that I can hear my voice like resonating through me. I can also, like, also your voice can kind of, as I'm hearing it, can kind of resonate in the same way. It's like, it's like this kind of circling of, or shifting of perspective, and in this mode, I have another, it's like I have another possibility to follow you along, and like, to follow a drawing that is that kind of gives way, that your voice, or like the words that you're saying, your sentences, like gives way to, and for me, this is like the moment, where it's kind of like, it's then suddenly it's it's somewhere, like I'm drawn to somewhere else. So like it's this openness, like given way to like more facets, or like more dimensionality, and I was thinking about the intonation, right? Because it's like, I mean, and he's also like in the lecture he's speaking about Heisenberg, and kind of the physical, like scientific cutting edge where Heisenberg was going in terms of quantum physics, and that there's also this, there's something resisting the immediate grasping if you're not like the kind of the same level. Also Heisenberg was probably all his life like practicing kind of his physical thinking. They're all like, as Einstein was also really interested in philosophy, I guess, and so, now keeping this in mind, for me it is, I'm now you can say, okay, this like meditating, or like contemplating, and coming back again and again to this sentence, like let's say the one from Parmenides, is kind of so what to do with it, like, kind of there's there's more and more explanation coming up, or different, like, let's say, different interpretations, and you could say, okay, there's not, not a kind of there cannot be the kind of exactness or like certain, like this way that we do like in a scientific, in a scientific stance that we, there's also the word bestimmen in German, which then at some point also in philosophy becomes this like to keep at place in speaking, and not letting go, but to keep at place, to keep certain, and that's why the English like translation said, it's like it's really clear. It's like determination. This is determined. Like in speaking, I hold this. I keep tight to it. I grasp it. But now the danger, I guess that or like what Heidegger is saying also is like that we, that, and what then also I think Gadamer took up, that like that we don't see anymore, like truth is not revealing for us. This could happen in art, or like in classical texts, in literature in general. And Gadamer has a really interesting answer to, or like he's saying now, because like there could be the critique to interpretation, or like explicating, unfolding, right? There's also this this opening up character to it. And now there could be the critique. Now what is the measure, or like how will we ever know that we are like, that we get closer to it, or that we are not going away from original meaning? But Gadamer says, right, it's the, like we have actually, there is like a dimension against we can like measure, but against we can test. It's the response. It's the response of another person, and this ties deeply back, I guess, to our beginning, like to listen to John Vervaeke, like this response, and this, and there it, it's not only like listen to the position of the response, but it's like, what is this, what is this person, this individual, also with his like kind of history? What is he like if there is, this atmosphere of like that you let go and like you show your vulnerability, right? Like what is like spoken, or like what is invoked speaking? I think that is that is like, no, it's like the ontological difference in like hermeneutic that is a kind of stressed.
Right. This sense of this, I love what you just, I love the different things that are being impregnating the conversation, right? But this linking between Gadmer to where we can kind of know whether or not, right? Like we can, there is something, is that we can listen for the response, right? And there is that quality that that's where the risk is, especially if you're going to think conceptually, especially if you're going to think those things that are precisely addressing you, that you don't know the name of yet. Right? Like, and you start to speak it out, it's in by virtue of which that it's in some sense what is to be said is you're housing it. It's so near that there's no way that you could be totally clear on the matter, right? And I think this is exactly why philosophers spend most of their time thinking previous thoughts of other philosophers, and because what there is to be thought is what was left unspoken or unsaid or ambiguous in the thinking. And that in some sense there is this openness, right, to that like that maybe actually what I think I'm talking about, right, actually conceals, right, the very thing that really is what's speaking to me, right? And so there is this kind of quality of of incompleteness, of hermeneutic kind of understanding that well, this is, I think, why we're so vulnerable, is because we barely, I don't even know if we exist exactly. Like we're somewhere between appearance and being, right? We're somewhere, like it's so strange to even look at like what kind of thing are we? That's not so clear, right? And self-evident. However, if so much about being a person, right, has to do with this between, like Tillich would call it, evoking Tillich here, like we call it that the human being is the tension between the mystery of participation and the mystery of individuation, right? So like we're even like two like inexhaustible mysteries that are inexhaustible. We're between both of those. In fact, we're both of two inexhaustibilities coming together. And so there's this humbleness, right? That if you're to really kind of articulate what you think that you're hearing, or what's responding itself to you, it's so about letting go. And the other thing about this, just to kind of bring this in, I thought about like kind of talking about like a loss and vulnerability, right? In some sense, this agape love, right? These kinds of levels of love where this arises from, right? Is in some sense the kind, is by definition is a commitment to lose, because it's not a possessive love, right? It's a love that is loved by the sake of that by through loving it is a declaration of something, reveals that which I cannot possess, right? So there's this kind of quality of grief and beauty and truth, right? Like listening to the response, if anybody responds, and also the vulnerability of that. Probably what if I say anything, I probably will never be clear on it totally. Someone else will have to feel into the ambiguities and draw out what I didn't know I was trying to say, right?
I think what's also getting disclosed in vulnerabilities, right? Your being kind of like shows that right, the border between me and you is kind of like blurry and ambiguous. Yeah. And so is the center of me, right? Yeah. And kind of like when it gets really at the edge, then it's like kind of like vibrating, and it's kind of like, but then it also, you see how kind of like you are you don't even know where yourself begins and where it ends, and that we kind of like when we reach these liminal zones, how we need to treat this with care and letting go. I think that Gennaro quotes Augustine and says to love is to let go. Yeah. And we kind of like, even when we talk about holding, that it's kind of like it's like holding something as if it's the most precious thing. So kind of like it's such a loose holding in a sense. But still I'm giving it, sustaining it, right? Kind of like giving it a little firmness, although it's the lightest thing in the world, so to say. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I was just going to say that it reminds me of Nietzsche's phrase of like returning to the lightness of a child at play, because I feel even when we were talking about listening, so at first maybe there's a tension between being attentive and letting go and being distracted, and then you become maybe a bit more attentive, but then you reach a level of attention where you let go. So it's like, I was just thinking that when I was listening, it's like there's a process, and it's almost like a process of mastery, like in the same way that maybe you learn piano and you're attentive and then you let go maybe, when at a certain point, I'm not saying it has to be done in this order, but it just reminds me that circularity, that turning back to the child at play of that Nietzsche. Yeah.
Hermeneutic, right? Yes, the hermeneutic. Yes, right, right. What? Make sure and sound that out. The thing you're writing.
For the past few minutes.
We'll in about 5 minutes.
Sure. Just one thing, because I've never really been able to be an articulator of what is encountered, and then just because it's been kind of shared already, that image of, let's say, an old man sitting next to that eternal spring that is both sound and light. But it's not, there's a glowing and there's a singing, but there's just a listening. There's not too much of a speaking, but I was just thinking that, and this is not just totally personal. The thing that I was imagining that old man would do would be to simply like build the perfect chair in order so that after he's done sitting it and he passes away, someone else could find that place in order to sit in that spot and then to also listen to what he listened to. Mm-hmm. Not to necessarily leave etchings in the tree, but to leave a chair. Because a chair tells you what to do without saying anything. So you sit and you listen. So that's what I wrote down.
Right. That's great.
So any last things before we complete and then just go a little meta on the process and talk about it over?
I was just going to say, what you just said about the chair, it reminds me of that poem Daffodils by Wordsworth, which is kind of appropriate for this time of year. But the other thing I just wanted to mention that, when I was talking about the Aboriginal stuff, it was just that I was reading this book called 32 Words per Field by McCall and Magan. I just wanted to mention that that's where I got all of that from, because I realized I forgot to mention it earlier. So. I just felt like I was like, oh, I probably should have said where it's from. Otherwise, it sounds like it all came from me.
All right. Let's go ahead and complete just with what, if we just kind of take a moment, just take a deep breath and just go around and just say one word for whatever is present in completing this. I'll go first. Playful wholeness.
Thank you.
Yeah, gratitude.
Chair.
What's holding the me that is trying to hold?
Mm-hmm. You had to bring up the mother tongue of mother tongues, didn't you?